Hello from the studio of the World Economic Forum in Geneva, Switzerland, and welcome to this live panel session for an in-depth look at the wider impact of the 2024 Top 10 Emerging Technologies Report. I'm Stefan Kuster, Head of External Affairs at Frontiers, a leading open access scientific publisher with a mission to make science open so that scientists can collaborate better and innovate faster to deliver solutions to enable healthy lives on a healthy planet. Our partnership with the World Economic Forum in developing the Top 10 Emerging Technologies Report exemplifies this ambition. The World Economic Forum has been publishing the Top 10 Emerging Technologies Report, one of their flagship reports, since 2012. And Frontiers takes great pride in partnering with them for the second year running in developing the report. Over a decade ago, within the World Economic Forum's network of global future councils, a diverse group of experts began to explore the transformative potential of technologies that were, at the time, little known. These technologies have since gone on to create global waves of change. Consider CRISPR, for example, the precise genetic engineering tool that featured in the 2015 report. Just 5 years later, it earned a Nobel Prize in chemistry and is now revolutionizing agriculture by creating insect and drought-resistant crops in some of the world's most challenging growing conditions. Or mRNA vaccines, highlighted in the 2017 report, which a few years later became the foundation for the COVID-19 vaccines that have saved millions of lives worldwide. Our goal is to connect the dots between groundbreaking research and strategic development across industries, economies, and global issues. By doing so, we inform policymakers and ensure that open science can help accelerate global innovation. This year's report has already made a significant impact, with over 21,000 downloads and 122 media mentions within the first 3 weeks of its launch at the annual meeting of the New Champions in China. AI has once again emerged as a key player, featuring in technologies that help accelerate science discovery, alongside cutting-edge advances in IT infrastructure, biotech, and health technologies. We have also curated a special collection on our strategic intelligence platform featuring all the emerging technologies from this report, complete with dynamic updates on the latest research and analysis. I encourage you to explore this research at intelligence.weforum.org. Before we dive into today's discussion with our expert panelists, to connect the dots between emerging technologies, science, and policy, I want to emphasize that your participation from the audience is crucial. We look forward to your active engagement, so please submit your questions in the Q&A box on Zoom. We'll address as many as we can towards the end of the session. Joining me online today are our 3 distinguished panelists. Dr. Anna Laura Ross, Head of Emerging Technologies, Research Prioritization and Support at the World Health Organization. Professor Charlotte Watts, Chief Scientific Advisor and Director for Research and Evidence of the Foreign Commonwealth Office of the United Kingdom. And Professor Mohammed Slim Alouini, Al-Kawarzimi Distinguished Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia. Welcome. And I would like to start today by talking about how we identify technologies that have a real potential to impact societal well-being and industrial transformation, and about the relevance of technology foresight for you that work at the intersection between science and policy. And let me start with you, Professor Alouini. From your perspective as a scientist and having participated in the 2024 report, what makes an emerging technology? How do you identify the transformational potential of a technology in its emerging phase?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. So in my view, what makes technology in the category of emerging technology are 2 important factors. Factor number 1 is the fact that it is disruptive, that essentially it can bring a solution to important problems. So it is also impactful. And factor number 2 is the level of maturity. Some like to call this technology readiness level, or TRL. So these 2 factors combined make a technology emergent in the sense that it can basically solve impactful problem and it's ready to be deployed. As an example, one of the selected technology, and I have been involved in this technology from a research perspective, is high altitude platform station. These are stations that operate in the stratosphere at roughly 20-kilometer altitude. Why they are impactful? Because they have the potential to essentially solve in big part the digital divide. We live in a world where essentially still about one third of the world population is still unconnected or underconnected. Bringing connectivity from the sky can solve this problem, and hubs can contribute to that. That's from the first factor. And the second factor, which is the technology readiness level, we have seen a global increase in research in terms of publication, in terms of increase in citation, and worldwide on this topic of hubs. And also, we have seen essentially a movement towards going just from theoretical, I would say even experimental research done in university and in research labs to field trials, where essentially 5G connection have been demonstrated from the ground to these hubs stations. So to me, that's a perfect example of an emerging technology that hopefully we'll see deployed in the coming few years.
And Dr. Ross, from your perspective of a global governance organization dealing with global health policy, what is the use case of the 10 Emerging Technologies report? Does it allow you to address key questions around equity and accessibility of new technologies, for example? Does it allow you to anticipate societal debates around technologies?
Thank you, Stefan. And maybe I'll pick up just on one of the words you just used, which is anticipate, which I think it's absolutely fundamental. So from the World Health Organization perspective, we do implement work to identify and monitor emerging technologies. And we have a specific lens, which is, of course, thinking about global health, but also how we can ensure equitable access in a global context, in different contexts and different settings and with different resources available. And so similar to the work that the World Health Forum has been implementing and through the report that has been published, WHO does implement foresight methodologies. We do use horizon scanning. We also do scenario planning to be able to think about emerging technologies and unpack them in the light of global health. And so one of the things that I would highlight when you talked about anticipate, to me, actually, this is key, that we have to be able to anticipate and think about emerging technologies before they're ready and in different contexts. And where often we observe there's a gap, there is a lag between access. And this allows us to think about equitable access. So to your point, I think that by thinking ahead of time and anticipating rather than taking a passive stance, we can actually shape and mold some of the research and development pathways to be able to take in consideration different points. And certainly from the WHO's perspective, we think about one, the global health and thinking about the different contexts in which emerging technologies might be deployed and used. Secondly, obviously, to maximize the benefits, how can we make sure that these emerging technologies can be accessible and equitably accessible to as many people as possible? And thirdly, I'd also say we think about mitigating and minimizing any risks. I often say, I don't think there's a single technology that's completely devoid of risk. And if we anticipate and we unpack these risks, that might be ethical risks, or they might even be bio risks or any type of risk, then actually that helps us manage them ahead of time.
I imagine this resonates with you as well, Professor Watts, as someone who provides advice to government. How does technology foresight help in evidence-based policymaking, and specifically in foreign and development policy? Can it help accelerate development progress, for example, or identify potential market failures early to guide government action?
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. And yeah, a lot of what my colleagues have spoken about resonates very closely with the sorts of issues if sitting in government that we are thinking about. So in government, we want to understand what might those likely trends be, so that we can think about not only what is likely and how do we prepare, anticipate those likely changes, but also what might be less likely but a potential that as a government we need to be prepared to respond to. So if there's something that might be unlikely but potentially could be hugely significant, we still need to do that groundwork to say, well, if we do end up in that situation, what does that mean for our populations, for the breadth of issues? And when it comes to technologies, across government, we have multiple interests. It includes linked to prosperity, it links to security, links to health and well-being. Sitting in the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, our interests including very strongly in development. We are actually a major investor in how do we use advances in science and technology to accelerate development progress. So we very much invest in the science, invest in technology development, including in a number of the areas that you've highlighted in the report. And we're also interested in what might the geopolitical dimensions of this be. So where might, as different nations, might we need to come together to say, what are the issues collectively? How do we respond? How do we, as Anna was saying, how do we try and maximize the opportunities of this, but also collectively think about how we foresee and potentially manage downside risks. And that includes risks of increasing inequality as well as many other aspects.
Let's talk about AI. Of course, we have to. And how the speed at which AI has gone from being an emerging technology to being virtually everywhere has changed the way you view technology and technological development. I checked past emerging technologies reports, and AI makes its first appearance as an emerging technology in the 2015 report. And now its impact is undeniable. And yet, its real contribution to societal welfare and industrial transformation is still somewhat controversial. And we get the sense that there is a degree of hype around the reality when it comes to AI. So, Dr. Ross, an evidence-based report of emerging technologies, one imagines, should be helpful in separating hype from real impact. And I imagine that it is especially important in the field of global health. Can you tell us a bit about that ratio of hype to real impact and where you see the needle moving, for example, in the area of AI use for scientific discovery, one of the technologies recognized in this year's report?
Yes, thank you, Stefan. So as you point out, I think artificial intelligence has become part of our lives, whether we want it or not, whether as professionals in the professional context or even in our personal lives. I think AI is really creeping into society at a very rapid pace. AI is already playing a role in global health, for example, in diagnosis and clinical care. So it is now being integrated. I do think that we have to be careful and we do have to strike that balance between the hype and the reality. And certainly the applications need to have careful consideration and we need to think about how it is integrated in the context of global health, for example, but I'm sure it's valid in other sectors as well. I think what we're seeing also is how AI can help and facilitate scientific discovery, advances in science and technology. And I think an example that is probably familiar with much of the audience is the quite mediatized example of the role of artificial intelligence in predicting the 3D structure of proteins. And this is something that struck me personally because two decades or so ago, I would spend an enormous amount of time with my colleagues doing X-ray crystallography, trying to understand the structure of proteins, because this gives us a lot of insight into the molecular functions of the proteins, and it helps then develop targets, medicines, etc. And so now the idea that we do have tools that can do this in the blink of an eye and have really quite good predictability, I think does show the extent to which artificial intelligence can help progress advances in science and technology. And there are obviously other examples as well. Again, I do think that we need to remain grounded, we need to remain cautious, we need to make sure that these are valid and we have the evidence to prove that these type of advances do provide sufficient evidence in what we're showing. WHO has obviously been looking at artificial intelligence for quite a few years. We have published a number of reports, and I think this is precisely it, trying to make sure that we do strike that appropriate middle ground. We do have to be careful. There are a lot of ethical considerations when we talk about artificial intelligence. We do have to think about responsible AI and global health. And we have a recent report from this year that really delves into this notion. And also around some of the regulatory approvals. How do we regulate approval of a AI-based diagnostic device, for example? So there's obviously a lot that needs to be unpacked. So we need to follow advances in science and technology. We need to make sure that we harness them, but obviously we can't always go too quickly. So we do have to make sure we're advancing in the appropriate context and with the appropriate frameworks.
So, Professor Watts, in providing evidence to government, how is AI featuring and how has that changed your role and the advice you're providing to government?
So AI is incredibly useful. And I mean, a bit like Anna said, it's integrating and sort of influencing many things that we do, our ability to access information, our ability to synthesize in real time the latest evidence coming on a particular question that we might have, that we are advising on. You know, things have become so much easier if you have the right tools to access the benefits of AI. It's very useful, but it's very much in combination with a smart user that actually I think is when we realize the benefit. The other ways we're using AI, for example, is just enabling us to combine data very quickly. For example, when we're supporting responses to humanitarian crises or other potentially fast-moving events. But you know, I come from development as a background, and for me, I feel very aware of the issues around the hype when people start talking about what might be the opportunities more broadly. So at one level, you know, we do believe AI has incredible opportunities to accelerate delivery of the SDGs to support development progress. But you know, we have to be realistic about, you know, AI is dependent on data. What is the data being used? What is the quality of data? What is the coverage of the data? What is in there? But what isn't there? You know, clearly there are massive differences in the data that's used for training between geographies, with far less data coming from the poorest countries. Issues of bias linked to what's the language, what are the sources even of evidence that might end up going into some sort of learning process, model training process. And you also have just the issues of digital access. So if you do develop algorithms or tools, who actually can use those tools? Can the most vulnerable benefit from those opportunities? Or what are the tools being developed? Who's driving that agenda? Even, you know, there is a real risk of well-intentioned work done but actually isn't speaking to and addressing the real priorities of partner countries and communities in the global south. So for me, the aspects of the hype are linked to all of those underlying issues. I mean, some of the actions we're taking to try and address that is linked to the AI summit that we had last year, launching a major initiative on AI for development, bringing in a breadth of partners, very much trying to focus on AI by Africa, for Africa. So investments in supporting and strengthening AI institutions that exist in Africa, really investing and supporting out the development of tools that are relevant for the priorities that are defined by those countries, and also supporting greater policy engagement internationally on AI by the Global South, to try and address that fundamental challenge of inequality and who benefits as the opportunities of AI do start to get realized.
And let me bring you in, Professor Alwini. As a researcher, what has been the impact of AI in your field?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. My area of expertise is wireless and satellite communication. And indeed, clearly we are seeing AI playing a big role in designing, planning, managing, maintaining emerging and future networks. The reason is simple, again, going back to the example I gave earlier, where essentially we are going towards these so-called three-dimensional networks. And by three-dimensional network, we mean network where base stations are not attached anymore only to ground towers, but the base station can be attached to drones, can be attached to this high Alt platform station in the stratosphere, can be maybe even attached to low Earth orbit satellites. Also, the users are not anymore used in the ground. We are seeing more and more a desire to connect flying, let's say, taxis, drones that are picking much dice from point A to point B. So we have this three-dimensional network that is clearly a network that is quite complex to design, to optimize, to maintain. And here where AI can bring very useful solution to design and optimize and manage this network in the sense that solution can be done and executed relatively fast compared to kind of old-fashioned trial and error type of solution, and also solution can be executed with relatively speaking minimal energy consumption, which is quite important when we talk about aerial base station attached to drone or hubs where energy consumption, energy constraint become an important factor. So clearly AI is playing a big role in research now. Down the road, we'll see it more and more being used in deployed network to run these very complex networks.
And let me bring in a point that Professor Watts made before, that AI can only be as good as the data it is fed and trained on. So in research, as a scientist, Professor Alwini, what ensures that we are training AI with verified science and research-based evidence rather than, I don't know, low-quality information?
Yeah, I mean, that's of course, it's critical to have access to good data. Now, when you do research, there are some database, like when you do research and you are trying to optimize algorithms or to come up with the new, let's say, protocols, and you want to compare and benchmark, let's say, the performance of your algorithm in comparison to other algorithms. In many cases, there are some, let's say, to be fair and to be in a way essentially kind of comparing apple to apples. You may have you are given some databases that are accessible to all the researchers. So basically, the let's say the developed algorithm can be trained on the same kind of data and also can be tested on similar kind of situations. So in a research environment, the rule can be set clearly upfront so that the competition, let's say, or the comparison of different schemes and different algorithms can be done in a fair fashion. Now, of course, for deployment, things have to be done carefully, and indeed, like Professor Watts mentioned, one has to be careful about how clean are the data, how reliable are the data.
So essentially, that's also a question of trust. And let's talk about trust in technology and in science for this closing part of the session. It's a hugely important issue. And I imagine when it comes to the deployment and societal acceptance of scientific research and technology, it does hinge on the trust that society places in the science that went into the technology and the technology itself. So how can the 10 Emerging Technologies report and how can technology foresight strengthen trust in science? And how do you in your daily lives encounter this issue of the trust in science and of the trust of the public in science and technologies? Let me start with you, Professor Ross, on this question.
Thank you, Stefan. And I think it's fundamental because we're talking about disruptive innovations and new technologies, and they're only as useful as how they're actually used. So you can have the most amazing innovation, but if it's not actually used because people don't trust it, then it's completely useless, obviously. And we do see this. This is a reality. I think that when I think of global health and we look at vaccination hesitancy rates, for example, this has a direct impact. I believe that surveys have shown that often there is a correlation between a lack of trust in science and a lack of trust in governance and national authorities. So that I think we need to unpack a little bit what is happening. Certainly, one of the things that I do think is important is societal engagement and how we can bring society into the process. From a point of view of research and development, I think we need to think that the scientific community is not a completely close-knit, hermetic, waterproof society and community that doesn't have links with the outside world. We need to ensure that the users are brought into this process. And we do that, and we have done that quite successfully in various areas. I spent a lot of my career working in HIV research, and I think the HIV community has been traditionally one in which people living with HIV were part of the scientific process of many of the trials and the work that was happening even 2 decades ago. And I think we need to think about these models, continue to bring in society, and even expand that. How do we bring in all elements of society and ultimately the users so they can understand and shape the process where it makes sense?
So, Professor Watts, we all remember, the COVID pandemic, and during that time, how scientific advice and decisions by policymakers based on science were basically being streamed into our living rooms every evening. And a lot of the effectiveness of those measures depended on how the public trusted that advice. How has that changed, and how do you deal, and what do you advise your government when it comes to the trust of the public in science?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think COVID was an important crisis where scientists came to the forefront in terms of, I think, supporting government and sort of community responses to the pandemic. I mean, in the UK, and I saw it happening in many other settings, scientists worked really hard to try and synthesize, as the epidemic evolved, what do we really know about the evidence? What do we understand? And actually, what are we less confident about? So in the UK, for example, we had an expert group called SAGE. Hundreds of scientists fed into synthesis of evidence, which was then condensed, and that was then sort of fed into discussions that our politicians were having. An important step there is that those discussions were made public and published, and anybody could access them. And actually, in my international engagement on COVID, lots of other countries were using those evidence syntheses to shape that thinking, and scientist to scientist conversations were, we were all learning from each other about actually what do we understand and what are we less clear about as the pandemic evolved. I think some of the key learnings coming out from that is that issue of transparency. And it's that transparency about what does the data tell us, but also where, especially in something like COVID, where the situation is evolving, also where the science is less certain, was very important. And then underlying that, and particularly when we got into having vaccines and other technologies, also what is the methods underlying the vaccines that have been produced. So sort of, a scientific, explaining the scientific process that had happened to produce and test and ensure we have safe vaccines that could then be deployed. An important element in that also is bringing in the voices of users, for example, when we had vaccines, and also making sure that the experts can be, in the media, able to kind of respond directly to the questions and concerns that the public might have as that situation evolves. And we use that very often in other aspects of technical communication as well.
I do want to bring in some questions from the audience at this point. We have the first question is actually from an anonymous attendee, so I cannot name you, I'm sorry. But the question is a very interesting one. It's how is emerging technology delivered to the most disparate regions and people, especially when services are not currently available in some regions of the world? So I'll start with the WHO, Dr. Ross, but then maybe the others also have an opinion on this. How do you ensure deployment across the globe of a new technology?
Sure, thank you. I think it's a really important question. And I think very briefly, I would say that these are one of the important considerations because otherwise we don't have equitable access. And so in certain developments, we need to think about where is this technology going to be deployed, in what setting, what is the environment? A basic example is, and a quite banal one as it were, but it's around some of the devices. We often see and hear about these new exciting devices, but they need to be in very strictly temperature controlled rooms. Now, that is, of course, a first limitation. That is not going to be deployed at a point of care situation all around the globe. So we have to think about some of these elements. And that's why I was saying, I think when we start and we're part of the research and development process, we can try and understand how we can adapt and make sure that technologies are as widely accessible as possible.
Professor Aluini, do you have a view on this? How does your research basically travel across the globe and reach communities that can benefit from it?
I mean, clearly, many of the technologies can be transferred in a digital way or like through communication systems. We still live in a world, indeed, as I mentioned earlier, where roughly 1/3 of the population is unconnected or underconnected. We are talking about 3 billion people. And going back to what Professor Watts was talking about in the context of COVID, COVID also was a great lesson in the sense that it showed us that connectivity in a way is one of the modern face of inequality between those who have and have not in this ICT or digital context. Now, connecting more people through many solutions that are being proposed and hopefully will be deployed in the near future will give more access to communities who are now underserved, who don't have access to many of these available solutions that more densely populated urban environment are benefiting from, because usually rural areas are the ones that are deprived by connectivity. In other words, many of us in the research community in wireless communication for all are advocating to go beyond this narrow concept of a smart city, which is an important concept also to manage efficiently cities, to something broader, which kind of includes smart villages, smart hamlets, smart living. And with that, we have an opportunity to transfer and give access to many of these technologies to a broader audience and not limited to a smaller set of people who are living in, more, let's say, more connected environments.
Thank you. I have a question from Sherbano. Please come in, Professor Watts.
Yeah. I was just quickly going to add, if you don't mind, on that last question, because it's one that we care about a lot in the research investments that FCO, my department, manages, which is really, there's a fundamental market failure that the issues that the most marginalized and poorest populations face will not automatically get solved by these advancements in technologies. And for me, that's why it's really important that governments like the UK invest in how do you really think about the use cases of for those populations, be it a village, be it various underserved communities. And then you're thinking not only about what is the technology, but what might be an offline solution, or what might be the fundamental infrastructure that also needs to be supported, or how do you get it so that the cost is really, really low, so it has a greater potential to expand at scale. And it's those elements that I think we can't ignore if we are really going to make sure that the opportunities of technological advancement does really benefit at a large scale, and not just be useful for the most privileged.
And on that point, I have an excellent question here from Sherbano, someone who's working on the front lines of addressing the polio epidemic in Pakistan. And they make the point that many interventions seem to widen the gap, especially between urban and rural areas, and even across provinces. So how do you approach accessibility and technological advancements when the digital divide in the global south is so pronounced? Let's start with Dr. Ross, but then again, Professor Watts, I'd like your opinion here, and also Professor Alouini. Dr. Watts, Dr. Ross.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for the question. I think that similar to the previous question, I do agree, and I think that this is where we need to think about emerging technologies. First of all, I personally don't believe that emerging technologies as this catch-all phrase is going to be the panacea for society. So I think we have to, there's also a little bit of hype. We were talking about hype and reality. So we need to consider that first. The second thing I would say is that if we take a very passive stance, then we do risk widening the gap between high income settings and more resource limited settings. So this is why we need to take a proactive stance, and we need to anticipate, and we need to really think about what these technologies, how they're going to be deployed, what are the limitations, how we can maximize the benefits, because otherwise I do agree we can inadvertently widen that gap.
And Professor Alouini, a short point on this?
Yeah, I mean, basically, this is an agreement with what I said earlier. We need to make sure that we reduce inequalities because and digital divide is one clear aspect of inequalities that we face today. And fortunately, I think there is now kind of a clear, I would say, understanding that. For the context of digital divide, that we need to do more efforts in trying to connect this remaining unconnected. As an example, we look at the previous generation of wireless communication system from 1G to 5G. This aspect has not been really seriously considered, I have to admit. This generation of communication networks were mainly driven, and there's nothing wrong with that, by financial and profit consideration. Now, the good thing is that the 6G, which is expected to be deployed by the early 2030s, is including, by definition, in its vision, this kind of global connectivity as a requirement of 6G. And connectivity does not have to be the same for everyone, but at least the minimal level of connectivity has to be offered to everyone. And that hopefully is going to be part of the 6G vision and 6G eventual deployment in the early 2030s.
Okay, thank you. That's all the time we have for questions from the audience, I'm afraid, but it's great to see so much engagement. Before we close, I'd like to ask each panelist to deliver a short closing remark and leave the audience with what is your main take-home message. And I'll start with Professor Watts.
Great, thank you. Well, I suppose key points here, I think our discussion has highlighted, we are really in a golden age of science. The opportunities are incredibly exciting to really create and accelerate development to tackle the breadth and compounding threats that the world faces, including the poorest and the most vulnerable. I think the foresighting work that the World Economic Forum and others do is incredibly helpful to enable us to spot those opportunities. And as somebody who invests in research, also to think about how we shape and shape how those technologies are developed, and particularly how they can be applied in the most impactful ways, and to try and address the risk of inequalities in the benefits. And lastly, I think this conversation has highlighted how the importance of us working collectively in that endeavor, so that we move from the hype, and there's a lot of hype, to really actually achieving the reality of the potential of the technologies that you've highlighted in the report and that we're seeing more broadly as well. So thank you.
Golden age of science, that's music to my ears. Professor Alouini, your take-home message.
Yeah, my take-home message is from a researcher perspective. I think, of course, we need to keep pursuing, let's say, Olympic record from a science perspective, but also we need to listen to people. We need to listen to users. We need to listen to societal impact of science and try to address that. So even sometimes research upfront doesn't look maybe very interesting and very motivating to solve. Essentially, let's say, going back to my example of digital divide, when you dig into it and you see that actually solving these kind of problems, where we bring global connectivity, we bring connectivity to this underserved region, can actually bring some interesting research problem that can be impactful and that can have also, good research problem to solve. So I think listening to people and listening to societal problems is an important aspect that researchers have taken into account in picking their research problems and research topics.
Thank you. And Dr. Ross, you get the last word. What is your take-home message?
Thank you. And I would concur with my two co-panelists. And in particular, I think Professor Watts, I would have highlighted many of the points that you raised. So I'll be very brief. I would say I absolutely agree. Science and technology has a huge potential of benefiting human health, which is what I'm particularly interested, but more broadly society, and bring positive progress to society. So I think we need to foster a very vibrant and dynamic research and science environment. But, and of course there is a but, we do need to think about the frameworks in which these operate, the governance of certain technologies, how we can shape and mold the pathways, because ultimately we want science and technology to be able to bring more equity and more prosperity and more health to the society, and not exacerbate any of the gaps between high-income countries and less so well-resourced settings.
Okay, and that's our session today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I would like to thank our three panelists for their insights and for taking time out of their busy schedules to share them with us. And I very warmly thank you, the audience, for your engagement and questions. I hope this has been as enriching for you as it was for me. And if you haven't done so, please go check out the 2024 Top 10 Emerging Technologies Report. You'll literally get a glimpse of the future. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.